Come on, let's start. Oh, yep, and thank you for coming. As Pege and John Verani, the owners of our Argilla Farm, historic Argilla Farm, 107 Argilla Road, which many people call the Pink House. It's on the road to the beach. We have owned the farm for almost 50 years.
John, could we need to speak up a little bit more in the back? It's hard to hear back here already.
Okay.
And I'm only in the middle.
We've owned the farm for 50 years. Tonight we hope you'll find the topic as interesting as we have, the history of the farm. But before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge several people. First, Peggy, my wife, who has done an incredible amount of research about the farm, which is 390 years old. A lot of research. She learned that she's related by marriage to Samuel Simons, who was the second owner of the farm. Thomas Franklin Waters, the recognized authority on Ipswich's early history. He wrote and published extensively on the history of Ipswich, including Argilla Farm. And the farm's history is inextricably entwined with that of the town, going back to 1633. Gordon Harris, I think, is here, our town historian, to whom we owe a debt of gratitude for his maintaining his extensive website, historicipswich.org.net. Terry Stevens, you've met, executive director, and Stephanie Gaskins, president, who managed this wonderful Ipswich institution so well. Thank you for inviting us here tonight. And gee, I didn't realize we had so many friends. Thank you all for coming. We're trying to make the talk as interesting as possible with stories and pictures about the various owners of the farm. Here's how I'd like to structure the presentation tonight. First, pictures of the house and the farm today for orientation purposes. Second, its early history, the founding of the town, its founding father, John Winthrop, Jr., who was the first owner of Argilla Farm, and Fred, a direct descendant, and John, another one, are here tonight. We celebrate their presence. Thirdly, we do a time period of family ownership over the ensuing 390 years. We're only the sixth family to own the farm in that span of time. And we're going to try to do the impossible tonight. We're going to condense that 390-year history into 1 hour. So let's start. First, how and why we bought the farm. More volume. Before we moved here, we lived on 1/2 acre in Wellesley, Massachusetts. And we bought a pony for our eldest daughter. And we boarded it at a friend's house. We looked around for a place where the pony could live at home. After looking at many properties in the Wellesley area, we received a phone call one Saturday night in October from an acquaintance in Ipswich who thought Argilla Farm might soon be for sale because the owners had just bought a lot down the street and were planning to build a house there. We promptly drove up to Ipswich the next morning. No one was home. We walked all around the property, you might say trespassed. And we fell in love with it. So when the Glessners came home that evening, we were waiting on the doorstep for them. They invited us in to see the house. We sat down. We waited for the Glessners to come home. We waited on the doorstep, and then we were invited in. We sat down, began talking. We made an offer, which they ultimately accepted. We spent the next 6 weeks developing an agreement whereby Jerry Kenny would buy the horse barn, the cow barns, and some of the land, 38 acres, for his Ascot Riding Center. And we would buy the remaining 108 acres and the house. Peggy showing you where the fields are and the house. At that time, mortgage rates were 18%. The day we put our house on the market in Wellesley, the local bank stopped giving mortgages, greatly reducing the chance that we could sell our house in Wellesley anytime soon. And we certainly needed the equity from that house to purchase this place. So in order to get a lower mortgage, we found the Federal Land Bank, a quasi-governmental agency, whose mission it is to help farmers. But to get the loan, I had to come up with a farm plan, a business plan for the farm. Who am I? I'm a kid from Wellesley. Never did a lot of farming. And so I did some research and came up with a proposal as to how we can make a few bucks a year by raising grass-fed beef, by buying 6-month-old calves in the spring, letting them grass feed for the summer, fatten them up with corn in the fall, and sending them off to slaughter in the winter, right before the winter, so we didn't have to carry them through the winter. We got the 8% mortgage. Got them home. We did raise grass-fed beef for several years, long before it was popular. We've also grown pumpkins, squash, and corn on the property. The primary crop today is hay for horses and cattle, which are owned by tender crop farms. We closed the purchase on December 1974 at the Salem Registry of Deeds. We had not sold our house in Wellesley, and I was Massachusetts Secretary of Consumer Affairs at the time, Fred will remember, and I would not have a job or income to pay the mortgage come January, because the governor for whom I worked, Frank Sargent, had lost the election in November to Mike Dukakis, you remember that. So it was a very stressful day, as you can imagine. In the basement of the registry, signed to buy the farm. Peggy was crying. Why were you crying?
I thought we were going to lose everything.
She thought we'd lose everything. I said, well, you know, you're a romantic, and you always said you'd sleep on a park bench with me if necessary. And she then said,
I've changed my mind.
and she went on to say, you got us into this pickle, you better get us out. So at the end of the session, we signed the deed, owned the farm, now how to pay for it. It's a true story. From distress in the basement of the registry, we went upstairs to a payphone. Do people remember those old payphones with the old enough? And where I called Putnam, where I had interviewed the previous week. They offered me a job as their first in-house counsel starting in January. So from the depths of distress to elation, we were young and we were foolish. This most daring purchase turned out to be the most wonderful decision of our lives. Here we are, 49 plus years later, just because we wanted our pony to live at home. Our friends in Wellesley thought we were crazy buying the farm. The Glessons, though, were wonderful. They were kind enough to have a party, a welcoming party for us, to introduce us to our new neighbors, including Kitty Robertson, Aunt Kitty, whom we all may have remembered. At the party, she asked me aside what we intended to do with the farm. She suspected that we might develop it with an Italian name and coming up with a big piece of property. I said, no, don't worry, Aunt Kitty. We love the open land. We're considering building just one little motel out on the Northgate Field. with a green flashing light that says, motel, motel, motel. She was aghast. But I assured her that I was kidding, and we became good friends. By the way, Kitty's wonderful book, The Orchard, which we're familiar with, is now being re-released. So if you haven't read it, now's the chance to read it. It's wonderful. So when people say to us, you own our wonderful, isn't it wonderful you own our Argilla Farm, historic farm? Our response is, no, we really don't own it. God owns it. We're simply caretakers of the land. Take a look at an obelisk we placed in our little orchard to the left of the driveway. On the front is inscribed Argilla Farm, 1634, the date of the land grant to John Winthrop Jr., the son of the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the founder of Ipswich in 1633. On one side of the obelisk, we have inscribed the words proprietor in perpetuity, Alpha and Omega. So you biblical scholars know that's a symbol for God, the beginning and the end. And under that, we listed our names as the temporal caretakers. So we're caretakers for our time, and our dates are inscribed there. With space for future caretakers, which we hope and expect will be our daughters and our grandchildren. Our daughters grew up here, riding ponies and horses. Two of our grandchildren live in Wenham. Our granddaughter, Isabel, rode several ponies at Ascot, and she rode at Holly Pulsifer's house and rode her pony over the years.
6 years.
6 years. She's a mechanical engineer, Isabel is, who is working temporarily as a wrangler at a dude ranch in Wyoming this summer. Then she returns to Boston for a new job. Grandson Nicholas grew up driving all the tractors on the farm and now comes regularly to help and to work and help me manage the farm. Nick's in the front row here. You look a little different. Another grandson from Cheyenne, Wyoming, had his wedding here this summer, like his mother and his aunt before him. The farm is one, if not the oldest, farms in continuous operation in New England, and perhaps in the country. We're only the sixth family to own the farm since its inception, and now for the rest of the story. John Winthrop, Jr., the first owner of the farm. We could talk for an hour just about Winthrop, the founder of Ipswich, because he was so famous, and so much has been written about him. But we'll concentrate on his being the first owner of Argilla Farm, which was granted to him by the townsfolk in 1634. He was born in Groton, England in 1606, graduated from Dublin University at 19. He had traveled extensively in Europe before coming to New England in 1631 on the Lion with his mother and his stepbrother to join his father, John Winthrop Sr., who was governor of the Mass Bay Colony. How would you like to cross the stormy Atlantic in that vessel? Which he did numerous times. I'll come to that. John came up the coast from Boston in 1633 in a shallop. Shallow drafted vessel with 12 intrepid men at the direction of his father, who wanted to create a settlement, a buffer, to keep out the Canadian French Huguenots who were in the Ipswich area trading with the Agawam tribe and who were threatening southward expansion. So Winthrop and his men came up the river in late March 1633, put ashore, we think, at the current town landing, or the pocket park adjacent to the landing. They made their way to the top of what became Meeting House Hill, which they proclaimed as the center of the town. According to an Ipswich Chronicle article in 2009, quote, of the 12 who came with young Winthrop to Ipswich, some died, some traveled away, some vanished into time, and some remained. Some are still here today, among them the Biggs, the Clarks, the Coles, the Gages, the Perkins, the Sargents, and others, and, of course, the Winthrops. What did they use for shelter in those first days? Again, from the Chronicle article, they lived in wigwams and underground caves for a brief period. Durable homes were built and crops planted as soon as the weather allowed. Roofs were thatched with salt marsh hay, like the Alexander Knight House, which is across the street from where we sit. Gardens were planted with turnips, parsnips, carrots, and many vegetables. Fish and wildlife game were abundant. Lobsters reportedly weighed up to 25 pounds. At first, the town was called Agawam, but that was changed to Ipswich in 1634, after the town in England from which many of the early settlers came. In 1634, Winthrop was granted the 300 acres which became Argilla Farm. The origin of the name Argilla is unknown, but it has been called that since the beginning. In Latin, it means gray clay or white clay, which is the composition of most of the land under Argilla Farm. At the same time, he was granted 2 lots in the center of Ipswich because it was required, and those lots are shown, it was required that everyone live within 1/2 mile of the meeting house. The next slide shows the in-town lots of 6 others who came to Ipswich with Winthrop. Winthrop's first wife, Martha Phones, and baby came from Boston to live in Ipswich in the summer of 1634, but both died shortly thereafter and were among the first interred at the High Street Cemetery. Winthrop then went back to England in 1635, where he married Elizabeth Reed, and then he returned to Ipswich in the Abigail, which is equally unseaworthy. Yeah. After which they had 2 sons, 5 daughters. While in England, Lord Say and Lord Brooke persuaded Winthrop to return to New England and establish a plantation in Connecticut called Saybrook, which he did in 1637. He also established another plantation called New London. Both Saybrook and New London later became part of the colony of Connecticut. He had transferred title to Argilla Farm and Castle Hill in 1637 to his brother-in-law, Samuel Simons, and their wives were sisters. Samuel Simons and Winthrop's wives were sisters. In the 1638 letter, Simons, who was still in England at that time, he asked Winthrop to build him a house at Argilla Farm. He sent detailed instructions as to its construction, which we'll talk about when I get to Simons in a minute. Winthrop was also careful to settle all the land claims of the native Agawam tribe by paying Masconomet, the tribe's chief, 20 pounds. Here's the broad grant recorded in the Salem Registry in 1638 from Masconomet to Winthrop, covering all Indian claims to Ipswich and Agawam. Winthrop also founded the Sawdust Iron Works in 1644 in Lynn and Braintree. Winthrop frequently went to Connecticut. To induce him to stay in Ipswich as its leading citizen, the townsfolk made a subsequent grant to Winthrop in 1637, which included all the land from the farm down to and including the beach in Castle Hill. It was signed by 57 men with lousy handwriting. The last John was not persuaded to remain. He decamped to Saybrook, Connecticut, and later became the first governor of Connecticut, a position he held from his 1657 until his death in 1676 at the age of 70. Winthrop died in Boston while attending meetings of the Commissioners of the United Colonies and was buried in King's Chapel with his father, John Winthrop Sr. John Winthrop Jr. was, in quotes, and I think this is from Waters, a colonial founder, a planter, a scholar, an alchemist, an astronomer, a physician, a soldier, a statesman, and entrepreneur. He's also been called America's first scientist. He was a true Renaissance man. He was also pretty restless. The next owner of the farm, his brother-in-law Samuel Simons, was also a towering figure in early Ipswich. In addition to Argilla Farm, he came to own lots of property in Ipswich, Topsfield, Boxford, Maine, as well as other states, including Connecticut and New Hampshire. He was a man of means and a leader in the community, serving as magistrate of the Ipswich court, town clerk, selectman, court of assistants, which was the Supreme Court at that time, and he rose to the role of deputy governor of the Mass Bay Colony, which he occupied until his death. He was a member of the landed elite in Ipswich, along with the Winthrops and the Appletons and others. He purchased Argilla Farm from his brother-in-law, John Winthrop, as I mentioned, in 1637. From England, he wrote a letter to Winthrop describing the construction of his desired house at Argilla Farm, and I'll quote from the letter. He said, "I'm indifferent as to whether it be 30-foot or 35-foot long, 16 or 18-foot broad. I would have wood chimneys at each end, the frames of the chimneys to be stronger than ordinary, to bear a good heavy load of clay for security against fire. The 2 lower doors to be in the middle of the house, one opposite the other. Be sure that all the doorways in every place be so high that any man may go upright under. The stairs, I think, had best be placed close by the door. For windows, let them not be overly large in any room, and as few as conveniently may be. Let all have current shutting draw windows, which we know as Indian shutters. I would have the house strong in timber, though plain and well based. I would have it covered with very good oak heart, inch board. I think it best to have the walls without be all clapboarded beside the clay walls. Here are photos where we think the original house stood, and the well, which is just off the driveway to Ascot, and across the street from the Hamlin Reservation. But he was also a slaveholder, as many of the early colonists were. Two 11-year-old Irish boys, Philip Welsh and William Downing, were kidnapped from Ireland, along with many others, in 1654 and sold, that is, indentured for 10 years, to Simons. The boys sued Simons for their freedom after working on his farm for 7 years, but the court ordered them to serve the remainder of their obligation to Simons. As Franklin Waters wrote, quote, "Here in the wilderness, far removed from neighbors, sat this lonely farmhouse, a little southeast of the present building. Here the worthy magistrate and deputy governor spent many restful days. In the time of King Philip's War in 1675, the General Court in Boston voted that a guard of 2 soldiers be stationed there at public expense to guard the house because it was so remote from neighbors, and he was so much in the country's service." Close quote. Simons had 20 children, 16 of his own. Yeah, he was a busy man. Yeah, he 12 by his first wife, Dorothy Hollikenden, plus 4 by his second wife, Martha Reed Epps, who came to the marriage herself with 4 children from her first husband, Daniel Epps. Only 8 of those 20 survived him. Upon Simon's death in 1678, he left the farm to his son William, who died intestate shortly thereafter. The court then appointed Hollikenden and Simons and Daniel Epps as executors of the Samuel Simons property, and his widow lived on the farm until her death in 1695. But by an agreement made in 1694, the property was then divided among his 6 living children and their spouses and 5 grandchildren. It's interesting that the property was equally divided between the female and the male children and grandchildren. Very unusual in 1694, where primogeniture, that is the first son inheriting everything, that was the custom and the rule. But this was equal treatment of all male and female heirs. Over the many ensuing years, son-in-law Thomas Baker, husband of Simon's daughter Priscilla, purchased those varied interests, those minority interests, from Priscilla's 8 relatives, and by 1717 he had reassembled all the acres, reconstituting the farm. Now the Baker ownership, from 1695 to 1825, 130 years of Baker ownership. 130 years, a succession of 5 generations of Bakers inherited and occupied portions of the farm. Thomas Baker and his wife Priscilla Simons lived in Topsfield, where he was a selectman. He was also a lieutenant and then a captain in the militia, a deputy in the general court for many years. He served as an officer in King Philip's War at Narragansett Fort in 1675. Picture King Philip's War. Thomas's son, Colonel John Baker, inherited the farm in 1717 when his father died. Like his father, he was very involved in the militia, justice of the peace, and a man of wealth and prominence. His first wife died without children. When he died in 1734, he left a widow, Mary, and 4 small children, and a considerable estate for their support. They're both buried in the High Street Cemetery. His son, Colonel John Baker Jr., was the next owner of the farm. He was town clerk for many years. He was a soldier in the Revolutionary War, a colonel of the 3rd Mass Regiment of Militia, at the alarm of April 19, 1775, but probably resigned his position soon thereafter on account of his age. Colonel John Baker's sons, Allen Baker and John Baker, inherited the farm in 1785, and Allen bought out his brother's interest in 1797. Allen was a private in his father Colonel John Baker's regiment, which marched to Medford on alarm of April 1975. In 1800, Allen built the substantial Federal-style hip-roofed farmhouse, which with some renovation we occupy today. The original front of the house faced east toward what was Caldwell Lane. Caldwell Lane is now the driveway between Argilla Farm and Ascot Riding Center. Here are sketches of the house, front and back, an original floor plan. Maybe anything to point out there?
Well, just to show you that later on, we'll talk about the changes that were made later, but see the stairway here from the front door, that very narrow, if you know old houses, very narrow, steep,
Winding.
turning around, and there was another stairway here, and this stairway is only to the basement. But you'll see later what the changes.
Major renovations made in 1947. Allen's son, Charles Baker, inherited the farm after his father's death in 1814. In order to settle his father's debts, and apparently his father became burdened with debt by building this house and doing whatever other commercial activity. 11 years after his father's death, he had to sell the farm at auction in 1825. Ephraim Brown, here we come to the Brown and Sullivan ownership of the farm. He bought Argilla Farm at that auction as the highest bidder, $3,345.80, which in today's dollars is like $103,124 today. Charles Baker also sold Ephraim other marsh acreage. Marsh grass was very important in those early days, used to thatch roofs, as mentioned before, for food and bedding for animals. Ephraim was married to Elizabeth Boardman, and they had 6 children. The Browns were prosperous farmers and pillars of the community. Ephraim Brown owned the main house. John Baker lived in the other house on Caldwell's Lane. Yeah. After Ephraim's death, his son Thomas contested his father's will, which names Thomas's brothers as heirs to the farm. He said that the will was improper due to undue influence and mental incapacity. He won over his brothers in court, and he inherited the farm. With Elizabeth, he had 1 daughter, Mary Elizabeth, and 4 sons, 2 of whom survived him. Those sons inherited the farm when Thomas died in 1889 and owned it until 1910, when their sister Mary's husband, John J. Sullivan, bought out their respective interests, putting the farm back together again, which is reminiscent of Thomas Baker buying out his wife's siblings back in the early 1700s. So this is the second time the farm has been divided up and then reassembled by repurchasing those interests. So in 1910, John Sullivan and his wife Mary purchased what is now 135-acre Hamlin Reservation across the road, which they kept until 1925. The large barn and the house, now on the Hamlin Reservation, were built by John Baker on Argilla Farm property in 1784 and moved from Argilla Farm across the road to their present location about 1916 or 17. Here's a wonderful 1899 photo of Argilla Road by Arthur Wesley Dow, which seems to confirm that fact. You can see the barns on Argilla Farm, which aren't there anymore, and they were moved across the street. Yeah, and that barn isn't there either. Right. In 1919, John J. Sullivan and his wife Mary sold a substantial portion of the farm to his next owner, Sherburne Merrill, and sold another parcel to him in 1930. Who's Sherman Merrill? He never lived at the farm. He lived in Essex, and he hired a farm manager to oversee a dairy operation. He built an addition onto the main house for his farm manager, Bob Mackenzie, and his family to live in, which is now an apartment on the main house. Argilla Farm milk was delivered throughout northeast Massachusetts. Here's some cows and their prices. Here's an Argilla Farm milk bottle. It's in a cupboard. Okay. Quoting from an Ipswich Chronicle article in 1996, said in 1946, during a sale at Argilla Farm, a Guernsey bull sold for $28,500, the highest ever for a Guernsey, which is, by the way, $446,000 today. It's a lot of bull. The bull was bought by Sumner Pingree, owner of Flying Horse Farm in Hamilton. I guess Sumner could afford it. S.M. Merrill, Sherman Merrill, the owner of the farm, received a record-breaking $212,700 in total sales from buyers from as far away as California and Canada. He sold the dairy herd because Bob Mackenzie had died. He was the farm manager who helped him build the prize-winning herd, and he died right before the sale. But due to his 25-year commitment to the farm, his family received proceeds from the sale. In 1947, so Merrill got out of business, and he sold the farm in 1947 to John J. Glessner. Mr. Glessner was a Harvard professor who wished to retire and operate a dairy business. He rebuilt a prize herd of Guernsey cows. There's a photograph of one of them, one of his prizes. He made extensive renovations to the house before his untimely death in 1956 at the age of 54. David and others from sure remember Mr. Glessner, Sr. But in 1947, Glessner raised the salt rock roof over the then kitchen, now the dining room, and to give the house its present configuration. The biggest change, he made the old back of the house into the new front of the house. He removed 2 stairways in the house and built a new one near the new front door. Peggy?
The old stairway was here, 2 of them, here. Took those out and moved it here. And this was the old front door, and now this is the front door. That's the stairway. And the kitchen, the original kitchen was this room here. I'll show you some pictures later. And then it was moved here, and in 1947 they moved it from here over here.
Okay, here are photos. Yeah, okay, we have the floor plans. He was originally, Mr. Glessner, was originally buried beneath a beautiful elm tree on a knoll in a hayfield on the farm. He was reinterred a few years ago beside his wife's grave in the Old South Cemetery. He's still there. The inscription on his tombstone reads, quote, "A man of great modesty, of a most plain and single heart, of an ancient freedom and integrity of mind," close quote. His widow, Martha Glessner, which many I'm sure on the road knew, she carried on the dairy operation with the help of Ralph Johnson, her farm manager. She kept impressive records, including names, registration numbers, and price paid and sold for the cows which won prizes and shows and commanded high sale prices. She conveyed the farm, ultimately, to her son, John Glessner III, also known to most of us as E.O. In 1963, she moved down the street toward town, up on Heartbreak Hill, with her husband, George Steele, where she lived until her death in 1978. She's buried with Steele and her husband in the Old South Cemetery. E.O. was a Boston attorney and later in his career a beloved teacher at the Pingree School He discontinued the dairy business in 1968 when it became unprofitable, the government having repealed the milk price support for dairy farmers. And the dairy on Old Essex Road, which still, the building is still there, was where milk was processed and sold from, that closed down. So Glessner then leased the dairy barns in 1969 to Jerry Kenny, whose Ascot Riding Center continues to operate in those buildings today. Here we are in 1974, back to 1974 when we bought the farm. Glessner sold 38 acres of pasture and the dairy barns to Jerry Kenny, and we, the Veranis, bought the farmhouse and surrounding 108 acres on Argilla and Northgate roads. We have preserved the essence of the historical character of the house, the original features, such as the original front door, paneling, wainscoting, working fireplaces in every room, first floor windows with Indian shutters, wide pine floors, original doors and hardware, and I couldn't believe a cistern under the entire dining room, under the floor of the dining room. It's still there 10 feet deep with some water in it, not used. A brick baking oven in what was the original kitchen, the baking oven, but we made the house amenable to modern day living. Our improvements, I'll tick through a few improvements that we've done over the years. We made a lot of fencing for horses and cows. We built a farm pond serving as water for animals and crops, such as this cornfield, you see it watering up from the pond, and ice skating. We stocked the pond with fingerling fish. One spring, I put in 50 trout, brown trout and rainbows. And the girls used to go down and chum the waters with some Purina trout chow. Carol knows what that is. And they'd catch a nice 9-inch trout, rush up to the house, and would pan fry for dinner. And it was delicious. That winter, however, we looked out on the field and saw an ice floe on the pond, and some kind of creature, an animal, on the ice floe. And he'd go over the edge and come up with one of my 9-inch prize trout in his mouth, and he'd go back and do it again. I was astonished. He fished out the pond, packed his bag, and left. And I didn't try to restock it because I didn't want to refeed him. It was obviously an otter. Prodigious fisherman. We built a garage modeled after an antique barn at William Fairfield Drive in Wenham, which we admired. So I sort of copied the architecture of that barn. We made a living room extension. An expansion matched all the wine floorboards and the dental moldings. We put on insulation and new clapboards. Our daughters complained that, Daddy, I'm cold, the wind is blowing and the curtains are moving and it's freezing in here. And I'd say, put on a down jacket, which they did. So we have insulated with the help of Don Wells, who was sitting here in the front row, master carpenter and good friend. And I think that's Don leaning over there, isn't it? Over the left. And we matched the original front door with a new front door. We put in underground wiring. That's the old front door. We put underground wiring to make the house look more like the original house. We tore off an old porch which was falling down in the back, put in wide pine flooring to match the rest of the house, joined the new porch to the kitchen, making one large room. The room is wonderful. We spend all our time there. The rest of the house is turned into a museum. That's the room as it exists today. We replaced the dead elms. There were 9 beautiful American elms when we came to the property. There are 3 surviving elms. We replaced the dead elms with more trees. This is a copper beech I'm putting in here. It's now a massive, beautiful, there it is, yeah, tree. Other events and activities at the farm. Our main crop, of course, as I mentioned, is hay. We usually get 2 cuttings per year. But last year, for the first time, because of the drought, we only got 1 cutting. This year, because of all the rain, Matt Kozaki, who is doing the haying for me, is having a difficult time finding a dry time to do a second cutting. But it's interesting, I think, if you look at the evolution of how we've done the haying over the years. Initially, David Wedgen, known to many of us as the farmer in Ipswich, he made rectangular square bales, and here the bale flying off the tractor into the wagon one with the grandkids watching, playing on the wagon. Lovely watch the haying. And then we graduated to round bales. Different technique, but there are the round bales all processed. Currently, Matt is chopping, well, this is more round bale picture. Kids having a great time. But the current technique, these are Matt's machines, massive machines. They chop the hay, turn it into silage. The machine spits the silage into a dump truck trailing alongside and takes it away, and you can do the whole field like that in a day. A couple of fields in a day. Amazingly efficient. So, next I'd like just to mention that as we did earlier, we've had weddings there, and we have found over the years some artifacts which we can show a picture of. These were found in the fields by me and others. Somebody with a metal detector came by and dug these up. There are shoe buckles. There are buttons. There's a clay pipe stem. There's a musket ball. There are coins. A 1983 silver dollar. 1883 silver dollar. An 1833 penny. 1833 penny. And an 1862 rare New Brunswick dime. Finally, another spectacle we enjoy annually is the myopia hunt coming through annually. We love to watch it. We did actually ride in it a couple of times, foolishly. But here they are coming across the pasture, having jumped the fence, and they gathered at the top of the hill, out of the farmhouse and looking out over the fields. That's our story and the history of the farm thus far. Hopefully it goes on forever in perpetuity. We've loved living here, raising our family here, and caring for this special place. Thank you for coming tonight and sharing in the history of the farm with us. I missed the mentioning those who have been helpful to us in keeping the property. Don Wells, I mentioned here in the front row, a master carpenter. Ben Staples, the chicoria tree, who has preserved my elm trees and other trees. And our current farmer, Matt Kozaki, the owner of Tender Crop Farms, and our grandson, Nick. Thanks to all of them. Again, thanks for coming. Any questions, or shall we go? Hi, John. John.
I just want to say what a pleasure it is to be here, seeing my cousin Frederick Crooks and also staying with the Clarks. I've always felt that John the Younger was a far more interesting guy than his father.
Yeah.
The very decorative bio as you scheduled it. But anyway, well, thank transplanted Bostonian living in Charleston, South Carolina. Culture shock.
You're forgiven.
John,
Yes, ma'am.
who was your research assistant?
She wasn't the assistant, she was the researcher. She did everything. And she did. She deserved all the plaudits and all the credit. Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir.
John, when is the hotel with the green flashing lights going?
As soon as Johnny can build it.
Yeah, that's right. I haven't got a building permit for it yet, but it's under consideration.
How about a 40B? Do you like those?
Yeah, right. Anything else? Again, thanks for coming. Enjoyable evening.